Welcome to our first Animal Matters series, which is sponsored by the Elizabeth A. Lawrence Fund of the Center for Animals and Public Policy. This is also being sponsored by the Tufts Elephant Conservation Alliance, as well as WAYS. And so I met Sherry at a conference last June when she was talking about this very thing that she's talking about today. And what's most notable is that most discussions of human-wildlife conflict are conducted at sort of the macro level, how much crop damage there's been, and how many people or animals have died or been affected. And what I was so impressed with is Sherry's investigation into the real human dimensions of human-wildlife conflict with elephants and how it pervades, how it affects the family, how it affects the culture. And so that was pretty interesting to me. So I persuaded her to come. So Sherry is in the Human Dimensions group of the Department of Forestry and Environmental Conservation in the Forestry School at Clemson University in South Carolina. And we're really thrilled to have her here today.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Well, hello, everyone. I hear there's a much bigger, wow, that's weird hearing yourself on a PA system. But there's a lot bigger contingent online. So welcome to those people online. I am Dr. Sherry Rodriguez. I'm an associate professor in the Forestry and Environmental Conservation Department at Clemson University. Been at Clemson for quite some time and have a pretty established lab in the human dimensions of wildlife. And I understand that there is here at the vet school some human dimensions courses that you can take, maybe one. But I want to start off just for anyone who doesn't know what human dimensions is. I want to do a little bit of sort of intro, take the opportunity to talk a bit more about my discipline. This is the three-legged stool paradigm that we use in wildlife management. So I'm a wildlife biologist / human dimensions person, human dimensions by my graduate training. And as an undergraduate and certainly beyond that, I really did more of wildlife biology, wildlife management. And so this three-legged paradigm obviously deals with the three portions that wildlife management essentially requires to function in an interdisciplinary fashion and address all aspects. Of course, we have habitat that wildlife needs in order to persist, but we also have what you all do, this aspect of actually dealing with the animal, the sexy parts of working in wildlife conservation, working with the physiology, the veterinary medicine, the genetics, the population dynamics, etc. This is where my work falls in. My work falls into the human dimensions, where we're talking about the economics of an issue. We're talking about the culture, the communication, the psychology, the policy. And this is really where I've found my home and my love, because while I am a big animal lover, it's really, as a younger person, that's what motivated my desire to go into the natural resource wildlife field. It's really my interest in people, and people as what I will call, somebody will argue with me surely, but people as the most unpredictable animal out there. I can tell you what I think people will do, but they always surprise me. And so it's never boring. It's just never boring. So how do we define the human dimensions of wildlife? It may be a little bit different than the way you all, as veterinary people, define it, but we define it as the portions of wildlife management that focus on the interactions between wildlife and people, or between people regarding wildlife. So oftentimes we can talk about human-wildlife conflicts and human-wildlife interactions without the wildlife actually taking an active part in that interaction or conflict. The idea that often it's two groups of peoples that come into conflict over wildlife, not the wildlife being purposefully conflicting, if you will, or purposefully targeting humans. That's a really rare instance where, there's actually research that indicates that animals are just being animals. Bears just being a bear. The bear is looking for food, cover, a place to raise its young. It's not typically purposefully coming into contact with humans. There's actually one instance in the literature as of 2012, one instance in the literature that shows that an animal specifically targeting humans, and it was actually a corvid, a bird, that was living along an urban greenway, if I recall correctly. And while people are moving on this recreational greenway, it had, this population of birds had the opportunity to, come into conflict with every human that used that greenway. It actually was only men on bikes and men running that were coming into conflict. So there were women with dogs, there were women with carriages, there were women on bikes, and it was only focusing on specific men, which implies intent. Otherwise, there's really not intent to come into conflict with humans. Again, it's just animals typically searching for their needs, meeting their needs. So my elevator speech, when people ask me what I do, it is, human dimensions. What I do is I study people in the context of wildlife. And so I have been lucky enough to write a chapter in the Wildlife Techniques Manual for the Wildlife Society. This is a 2020 publication, originally 2012, but provides a lot of information. I can send anybody more information if anybody's interested in learning more about human dimensions of wildlife. So really quickly, the human dimensions of wildlife is basically at the beginning, the middle, and the end of conservation and management. It's this idea that if a tree falls in the forest, do we hear it? Well, that's sort of the question when it comes to an event that occurs related to wildlife and humans. Is, if the event is noticed, then we go down this path that I'll go down in just a second. If it's not noticed, it kind of falls silent and we don't hear it. But it can, if it is heard, if it is noticed, then it's either deemed as important or unimportant. And if it's deemed important, then it sort of goes along the path of, do we research it or do we manage it? Okay, and that research and management can take many different forms, including veterinary science. I want to just really briefly talk about my path into human dimensions because I originally wanted to be a vet. I got an undergrad in biology and really thought, my path was veterinary medicine. And so I did an internship at UC Davis Vet School. I did everything right, and I never got into vet school. And it led me to some other really interesting things that I've done in my life. I worked for NASA for about 4 years. I did space life science research on space shuttles. So this is me floating in zero gravity on the Vomit Comet, which is a KC-135 that flies out of Houston. So I did a lot of laboratory animal work initially out of college. And then I ended up getting into grad school. So I decided, I'd gone to Africa. I knew I loved the animals. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do something with wildlife. Well, when I got to Africa, I didn't expect to fall in love with the people. I really was fascinated by the people. And so this is a photograph of me during my master's program. I was doing my master's research on predator damage compensation programs. So this is Kenya. This is actually a wedding. This is the groom right here, a Maasai wedding. This is the best man, and these are siblings. And it really sort of, for me, brings me back to this time where I spent months, researching people's experience with predator damage programs. So if your cow is attacked by livestock, you basically say, hey, I'd like my money back. And depending on the circumstance of that cow being attacked, the people owning the cow might get money back. And it led me, really get entrenched in this idea of my love of conflict. That sounds really terrible, but my love of human-wildlife conflicts. I see things happening around the world, and I'd give a finger to study that. It's just so interesting, sad and difficult and challenging, but so interesting. Did a lot of different things, ended up at NC State to do my PhD, and really got entrenched in the human dimensions here. I mean, my degree is in fisheries, wildlife, and conservation biology, but my focus is the human dimensions. I'm a social scientist. And I've been at Clemson for this is my 12th year now, and I do some pretty cool research. I'm pretty happy about where my professional career has sort of led me, and again, I get to do some pretty cool things. These are pictures from my first trip to India. I'm doing some research in India currently, and I've seen a lot of tigers, and it's kind of crazy. I ended up at a tiger university, never expected that would be what I do. So what does my lab do? We're the Rodriguez Human Dimensions of Wildlife Lab at Clemson University, and we focus on two things. We're a land-grant university, so of course we focus on state issues, and a lot of the state issues that we deal with are hunting issues because South Carolina has a lot of hunters. And if we're gonna understand how hunters use our wildlife resources and how they impact our wildlife resources, I have to study hunters. I have to study their behavior, their attitudes, and oftentimes, believe it or not, their conservation attitudes. Because hunters actually, if you ask them, and I'm not gonna knock hunters, I hunt myself, and that may not be a popular thing here, I don't know. But hunters actually have very strong conservation attitudes. It's really interesting. So I love my hunting research. I'm doing a little bit right now, not a lot, but it is this area, the human-wildlife conflicts, that has really taken over my lab recently. I have been doing mostly human-wildlife conflict research for about 5 years now. Little bit of other things here and there because, with my skills, my education, I can research anything. And so I've done forest pest research, I've done bat research, I've done a variety of different things. But really, it's the human-wildlife conflicts, particularly with megafauna, that I'm most interested in, and that which dominates my lab right now. So I'm presenting to you, of course, information today on some Asian elephant work that I've done in the past. But currently, I have 3 major projects going on. I am doing a jaguar project with one of my PhD students. She's Colombian, so we're working on some human dimensions work with regards to livestock owners in Colombia, in sort of the Amazon area of Colombia. I have a student doing some black bear research where on the coast of South Carolina, where there's just this one really large community that has a lot of bear conflict. And so we're spending time looking at how people behave around black bears and what they're doing that is either pro black bear or sort of causing problems. And of course, I've been working in India now for about 5 years. I have an ongoing project in India, and I just hired a new student to sort of finish this project. And so I'll be spending probably some time, maybe a month or 2 this fall in India working on some more tiger stuff. But today I want to talk to you about some research that I was lucky enough to collaborate on with one person in particular, who I'll introduce in just a second, but a group of people from various different institutions, but mainly the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, I have been a Smithsonian Fellow in the past. That is in the works again because we are just about to start another elephant project and a few other groups as well. So the concept, the design of the concept or development of the concept really came from this woman right here, Dr. Christy Sampson. And I'm hoping that she will be able to come and present some of her work beyond what I'm presenting today. She is an assistant professor at the University of the Ozarks. She was a postdoc in my lab for a while, and I was on her PhD committee. And she came to me, I think it was 2016, and said, you know, I'm doing this PhD on elephant movement in Myanmar. And I've collared, I think she had collared 6 elephants. And she said, my problem is they've all been poached. And I have no data. Myanmar is one of the largest intact habitats or ecosystems remaining for large megafauna like elephants and tigers. The problem is there's a lot of social issues going on in Myanmar right now. They're in the middle of a civil war. I actually have a friend who does war mitigation, and he is working in Myanmar on that. They were clobbered by the pandemic. And there's also a genocide that is sort of towards the end of what's going on there, but nonetheless, a lot of really big, complicated social issues. And because of this, there's a lot of pressure on people economically, a lot of lackings, if you will. And so Christy came to me, like I said, and said, I have no dissertation. Can you help me? Because I feel like at this point, I'm not gonna, even if I collar more animals, and it was a big effort with the Smithsonian and several other groups that they were out there collaring these elephants, and they just one after another were getting poached. And so, she had this idea. She said, I've been hearing some really interesting things that people are telling me about elephants, and I would like to do a social science, a human dimensions study, and understand better what is happening and why everything is ending up, in these poachings. And I said, yeah, sure. And so I think we spent about a year designing a questionnaire, a huge comprehensive questionnaire that is reflected in this work. So of course, human-wildlife conflicts are very complicated. Of course, they involve ecological, they involve political, and they involve social issues. They are not easy to address. As part of what I love about them is that you can spend your entire career, really understanding a human-wildlife conflict issue and not quite get there, but at the same time, you're making progress and hopefully making some changes. Human-wildlife conflicts are very different in their form, severity, and outcome because that varies. Those things vary by species, by location, by the status and culture of the people that are involved. And they range from pretty innocuous, like, it's not terribly terrible for us to have a squirrel on your feeder, or maybe even a bear that tries to open your bear-proof trash can. That's a bear-proof trash can there. He fails, he moves on. It happens at my home in Colorado all the time. And yet it continues on and gets more severe, where we have a coyote attacking a sheep, where this is likely involved with somebody's livelihood. So a bit more serious, but then it can also turn really crazy, violent, and dangerous for people directly. We are, of course, in the research, I should say, maybe not this group. I would imagine that you all pay attention to these sorts of things. I certainly do. But we are pretty well versed in the research regarding the direct impacts of human-wildlife conflicts. They are easily observed, they are quantifiable, they are easy to communicate as far as what is happening. They typically involve crop damage, injury to livestock, sometimes the death of a livestock, Other property damage, depending on the species, can be like, damage to a vehicle, damage to fencing. It really varies per the species. Occasionally, it does also involve injury of humans, sometimes loss of life. What I am most interested in, I am very interested in the direct impacts, but my interest really lies here in what are called the indirect impacts of human-wildlife conflict. And these are those impacts that occur downstream to the direct impact. You have an event that occurs. A lion attacks your cow and kills it. Okay. I'm interested in what happens after that, and that is the indirect impact. They're downstream, they occur after that initial event, and they are far less tangible, they are difficult to quantify, and they are far less known and understood. They can range. I mean, from my work in this area, we know that this can impact, these indirect impacts can damage psychological well-being as well social well-being. And just some examples of how they manifest: fear, sometimes post-traumatic stress disorder, sometimes so stigmas and I cannot say that word today, ostracizations. Excuse me about that, but that's okay. So their form and manifestation really varies depending on the species and the cultural and social context. They can also disrupt livelihoods and activities in a broader community, and sometimes they even involve economic issues in that downstream fashion. So if there's something that occurs that you lose your cow, and that cow would have brought you milk, or in Africa anyway, that cow, the dung from that cow would help you repair your home. There's impacts economically downstream that we don't really understand. We don't really understand any of this in the context of conservation and conflict in specific. When it comes to elephant conflict specifically, and I'm going to refer to it in my slides as HEC, it's easier than saying human-elephant conflicts every time. We have specific challenges. We know, of course, there's decreasing habitat for elephants worldwide. And we, of course, know that there's poaching occurring, and this is occurring in both continents, Africa and Asia, for both the Asian and the African elephants. And oftentimes, because of where these animals occur, we're talking about the involvement of disenfranchised communities. What typically occurs with regards to elephant conflict is, management and conservation groups getting involved. There's a collaborative community aspect, engaging communities into the conservation efforts. But this may not allow for a proper understanding of how the conflict actually impacts the communities themselves. Likewise, there are some sort of physical things that occur as far as mitigation. Typically, there's deterrence, keeping an elephant in check, fencing. In Africa, they use peppers. They string peppers on line to try and keep elephants away from certain areas. Sometimes there's educational, more longer-term efforts, education, land planning, etc. But really, despite that, and despite knowing a lot about the direct impacts, it's really the indirect impacts that we don't understand. Of course, the indirects are difficult to quantify, but despite that, we really have to understand all aspects that are contributing to a problem, to a conservation conflict problem, that will lead us potentially to a solution. Our goal is coexistence. And I realize that well, you guys may not hear this. I hear this all the time, that human wildlife conflict is not the word du jour right now. Coexistence is the word. We work towards coexistence. My view, however, is a little bit different than the norm, and that is that we have to understand the conflict in order to get to coexistence. So for me, I still think that conflict is a perfectly acceptable term to discuss because it's hopefully leading us to a solution towards coexistence. And this understanding of the indirect impacts, in addition to the direct impacts, is really, again, what it's going to lead us to the potential coexistence, but it is critical to the persistence of Asian elephants throughout their range. The previous literature on human-elephant impacts has mostly focused on direct impacts. They're fairly easy to study. They're not terribly, it's not terribly difficult to see, okay, well, these crops got destroyed or this house, got pummeled. It's not hard to understand that and quantify that. But very few of those assessments looked at indirect impacts. And those that did were almost exclusively, I don't think I can recall a single one that quantified those indirect impacts. Everything that was done was a qualitative research study. And qualitative, if you're not familiar with qualitative research, it really looks at themes. So you talk to people and hear what they say, and if they say it, it's important. If they say it, it's important. Only one person needs to say it for it to be important. It's not about numbers. It's about themes that emerge. And so, while we know that there are problems and we know the themes in which those indirect impact problems occur, we don't know how often it's happening. We don't know the severity. So in this project with Christy, we set out to hit two main objectives. And those objectives were first to determine and quantify which indirect impacts were affecting community members. And this is specific to elephant regions in Myanmar, because Myanmar has the last and largest population of wild Asian elephants. And we also wanted to assess how human-elephant impacts the conservation attitudes of the community members who are experiencing the conflict. Why did we pick, excuse me, why did we pick Myanmar specifically? Well, we have an ongoing partner, the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, and they have worked in Myanmar for at least a decade. Again, with Christy's work on the collaring of the elephants, they had been working there with her on that project. So it was a pretty natural collaboration to say, hey, we're gonna jump on your guys's permits so that we can go to Myanmar and do this research. We also, like I said, have high elephant, excuse me, higher elephant populations, higher than any other Asian country, and we have a lot of conflict that occurs in Myanmar. So we focused on this particular area right here, and we implemented a study. The study, we actually did two waves of it. So the first was between April and May in 2017, and then again, we went back in December of 2018. We did in-person interviews verbally with adult male and females, and we worked in two rural areas in Myanmar. So these are, as you can see, the sort of aqua color is the Asian elephant range in this area, and the yellow dots are the villages that we visited. So two rural areas within elephant range and that had experienced high human-elephant conflict. So we worked in the Bago Yagon region and the Irrawaddy region. Of course, when we got to these areas, oh, and I should say really quickly, why did we select these regions? Well, it wasn't it wasn't entirely random, we have to say that. And that is because these areas are very remote and inaccessible during rainy season. Myanmar has some pretty severe monsoons. So what we could get to is what we accessed for the study. So we obtained permission once we got to a village, and we used a stratified random sampling method where we approached, and I should say we obtained permission from the chief of the village, right? We never want to go into an area and ignore the authority that would give us permission. So we approached the nearest residents. We asked them if they wanted to participate. If they declined or there was nobody home, we moved on to the next proximate residence. We then skipped a residence and went to the one after. And this was not, these are not perfectly gridded types of villages. So nonetheless, we just sort of managed and mapped out what we were considering our path through that village. We continued until we had 40 residences interviewed per village. And we had a research team, local research team made up of employees of the Friends of Wildlife, which is a Myanmar specific organization. And we spent time, like I said, we spent a lot of time, Christy and I, coming up with a questionnaire. And this questionnaire was done in English initially and then translated into Burmese and then back translated into English for accuracy. We collected sociodemographic information, knowledge of knowledge of elephants and conflict, that we wanted to understand their beliefs about human-elephant conflict, perceptions of best practices for deterrence for conflict, and experiences with elephants. Direct impacts, of course, we wanted to know, but we also wanted to understand indirect impacts. So we asked about perceptions and experience there. And we also asked about attitudes towards conservation. And it's these specific parts, the sociodemographics and the experiences with elephants, that I'm going to focus on here. So first, let's talk about who our response rate and our average respondent. So we interviewed 381 adults, age range 18 to 84. We did 63 in the Bago-Yangon region and 318 in the Irrawaddy region. And our mean was 47 years old. They were male, 70%. 64 Bamar, which is an ethnic group, and it is the dominant ethnic group. These people tend to stay in one place for the majority of their lives. So on average, these people had lived in their village for about 31 years. About 85% had attended school, but that was the 5-year-old to 12-year-old time frame. So not beyond, not even past high school, middle school. 73% self-identified as farmers. And the mean income was about 1.7 million CAT, which is about $1,400 US. And what we found was that in the high conflict villages, people are frequently exposed to elephant. Big surprise, right? 90% had seen an elephant in the wild, and 34 had reported that they had actually been chased by an elephant, at some point in the past. We asked, of course, about direct impacts. 14% indicated that elephants had damaged their home. The average cost to repair for that was about just under $500. 7% had indicated that they had sustained tree or crop damage due to, tree or crop hut damage due to elephants. And I'll talk about that briefly in a second and show you a photo. And some had indicated they had some livestock death or injury. 1%, 5 people indicated they had lost livestock due to an elephant. And 63 or 17% reported that a neighbor had lost livestock due to an elephant. We used, to understand these direct impacts, we used statements. These are binary statements. So they were agree, disagree, or true, false type of statements that they had been, say, chased by an elephant, injured by an elephant, had livestock killed by an elephant, had a family member killed or injured by an elephant. And you can see here that what we're seeing is that, yeah, indeed, about 34% had been chased by an elephant, 52% crops raided by an elephant, 24% had other types of property destroyed by an elephant, and had someone, 41% had someone they personally knew that had been killed or injured by an elephant. So the negatives are that when we have crop raiding that occurs in elephants' crop raid, 49% would crop guard to prevent that from occurring. So this meant that they're staying up half the night to prevent that, to try and scare the elephant away. And you can start seeing the indirect impacts, right? Because when you're not sleeping, that's an indirect impact. Others felt crop guarding had a detrimental effect in other ways. So they impacted caring for children because they were tired or they were busy crop guarding. And this is one very traditional low tree sort of tree stand where they would sit in this stand at night. And there's a little bit of a hut here. Some are much bigger, but this is a really rudimentary one where they would sit here and wait for elephants to come and scare them away. And typically deterrence would be, banging pots together, making any big noise. But clearly that's not something that's going to sustain an elephant pushing it over. These people do die if an elephant attacks this. 60% indicated that they thought that crop guarding prevented them from getting enough sleep. 61% that thought that path of guarding and not getting enough sleep was leading them to be more susceptible to illness. And it was thought that it's really lowered immunity, and also lowered immunity because of the lack of sleep, because of the stress of having to be up to guard against elephants to hopefully not lose your livelihood to the elephants. But also there's a lot of diseases that are nighttime diseases, like malaria. It's a nighttime malaria mosquitoes. If you're outside guarding crops at night, you're more exposed to that type of vector that would get you exposed to that illness. A few more negatives. I've got a few positives, believe it or not. The negatives, 25% had not expanded their farm because they were afraid that elephants would come and destroy what they expanded. And 20% indicated they would grow other crops if there were no elephants present, that they would mainly grow rice because the elephants wouldn't destroy it too much. But if the elephants hadn't been there, they would grow mangoes or coconut or other types of crops other than just the rice. There were a few positive things that came out of the crop guarding. And that was that 25% indicated that they worked with their neighbors more to prevent loss. So it promoted community relations. And 20% said that it improved social bonds within a community. We did interview people who indicated that they had been injured by elephants. They all said they were more afraid for themselves and their family due to elephant injury. All were concerned for their ability to care for their children. And only 3 of them indicated this, but nonetheless, 1 of 3 indicated they had ongoing pain from the injury and that they suffered from PTSD due to that attack. 2 of the 3 indicated they felt they were more susceptible to illness due to that attack. And 2 of the 3 also indicated they had significant medical costs and were unable to work after the attack. 3 of 3 indicated that their spouse took on more work to compensate for their inability to do the work they previously had done. 11 indicated that we interviewed indicated there was a death in their immediate family. 5 of those 11 experiences change in household dynamics. So again, this is what I just spoke about, the spouse taking over activities that previously the one attacked would have done. This idea that the household has to shift in order to compensate for the person who is injured or attacked by that elephant. There's, other health issues as well that these people deal with. 8 of the 11 worried about safety more. So they experienced a significant amount of stress and a loss of sleep due to the fear of another attack, the stress of it. 9 of the 11 indicated this is a reoccurring theme, reoccurring this idea of being able to care for their children. And 9 of the 11 were more fearful of elephants. I'm running out of time, so I'm still doing okay, right? Okay. So we also spent time talking or asking about indirect impacts. We used a 5-point Likert scale, 6 items on the scale, where we asked them to strongly agree all the way to strongly disagree, representing the general indirect impacts for our entire sample. We got 268 people who responded to all 6 of these, and we used this information to get some patterns here. So as you can see here with the 5-point Likert scale, anything above 3 is a positive result, meaning I am afraid of elephants. Elephants will physically injure me. This is a 4.3 on a 5-point scale. That's high. They are afraid. Here we are at, I'm afraid elephants will destroy my house, also quite high. I'm afraid elephants will physically injure my neighbor or another person I know. It just gives you an idea that they have a fair amount of fear and with regards to these indirect impacts of an actual direct impact from an elephant attack. 99% of participants were impacted by at least one of the 6 indirect impacts, which means that these indirect impacts are pretty common. It may not be all 6 of them that they're experiencing, but they are experiencing a lot of indirect impacts. 85% experience fear for self or family. 68% fear that an elephant would destroy their home. We also looked at conservation attitudes. 10 statements, also a 5-point Likert scale. And we, again, looked at things like elephants should be protected by law in Myanmar. Elephants are important to the ecosystem. People who poach elephants should be punished. And in almost every case here, we saw positive conservation attitudes, despite the fact that people were negatively impacted by elephants. So what do we take away from this? Everyone experiences indirect impacts, despite half or less experiencing a direct impact. That's crazy right there. So you don't have to be directly impacted by an elephant to experience an indirect impact. It's inherent in the communities where elephants are. Indirects are not typically associated with conflict. We don't think about these downstream events or downstream issues as associated always with the direct impact itself. Most are likely unaware that there is a connection. And more indirects can lead to even more direct impacts. Fatalities at night by night guarding, lack of sleep or vigilance can lead to, again, more issues with attacks during night guarding. And indirects can lead to more indirects as well. Lack of sleep can cause more health issues, and crop guarding, again, exposure to more diseases. Despite the impacts, despite the direct and the indirect impacts, conservation attitudes were pretty positive overall, regardless of how much they were experiencing any of the direct or indirect impacts. And we attribute this to this idea that elephants are pretty important in the culture. And we see it in India a lot. I don't know a lot more. I know more about the Indian culture as far as like religion and sort of how they revere elephants. We don't see that so much coming out of Myanmar, but it is there. And therefore, their elephants are important. It's also we understood that, you know, some conflict rather, is expected and it is accepted. So, of course, we need to do more research on indirect impacts, on different types of human-wildlife conflicts. Different systems of human-elephant conflict would be great. I'm working on that, trying to find some new places to do some more indirect impact research with elephants. But we're also doing this with tigers. We're also doing this a little bit with jaguars. So we need to understand these indirect impacts a lot more before we can really figure out how to truly solve conflict and push us into a direction of more coexistence. We need to likely focus on people who have lost family members, who have actually lost people to these conflicts. And of course, expanding community assistance to include socially focused NGOs and entities that deal with conservation. This would make this idea of understanding indirect impacts much more ubiquitous. Currently, it's really only wildlife-focused entities that are involved right now. We, of course, published this paper in 2001. You can find it in PLOS One. I'm happy to send a copy of it if you would like to see it. And I would like to say thank you for being here. Thank you for listening and helping expanding all of our understanding of human-wildlife conflicts and specifically with elephants. So thank you so much. Yeah.
If you don't mind repeating it so that.
Sure.
How do these remote tribes react in American science?
How do these remote villages react to American scientists coming to their village to do research? Well, it really depends on where you're going and how much research has been done in those villages. So I've experienced areas that have survey fatigue, where they've been researched so much that they roll their eyes when they see you. But these areas in Myanmar don't see a lot of foot traffic from Westerners like me. They're pretty interested in who we are. But oftentimes, as conflict research shows, and I've seen this before in my own research, is that when you're going there asking about a wildlife species, they often assume that you own the animals. And that can present a lot of issues in and of itself, right? Oh, you own those elephants. You need to take care of your elephants. And so it can be pretty delicate. Haven't had a lot of problems in Myanmar. Frankly, the people are really friendly. Yeah, in India, I've had some problems where people get very upset. You know, your tigers, heard it in Kenya, your lions. But in this area, it's actually been really positive. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there could be. Yeah, so the question is, are there, because we had a majority male, 70% male sample, could there be maybe a different set of data if we interviewed more women? And the answer is yes. Women experience wildlife very differently than men. There's always a possibility that there's a difference. Women tend to be more protectionist. Culture aside, women tend to be more protectionist versus utilitarian. So yes, there's a possibility, but given we're addressing a conflict issue, I doubt that it would be significant. That's my hypothesis. Yeah.
You go to these places, I imagine it's like pretty distressing for people to talk about their trauma. Do you have like on staff in a psychiatric help at all, or like kind of give back to them, explaining their stories to you guys?
We, believe it or not, we don't. Well, that's not a believe it or not thing, but believe it or not, there aren't that many people who we find, first of all, who have themselves been attacked. It is something we have absolutely talked about. We are potentially inducing, revisiting a trauma that is, it's irresponsible not to think about it, but currently it's hard to get funding for that specific thing. We need to show that it is important first. And that means showing more extensively beyond just the system that it is something that we need to address while we're doing that research. But yeah, we have absolutely talked about that, and it is, it's distressing as a researcher that, yeah, we could potentially be causing psychological issues to somebody by bringing up a lot of trauma. Yeah, it is. It's hard to think about. Mhm. Yeah.
What was the administration of the, was it paper-based, verbal, how did you?
Yeah, it really depended on our electricity. So we had tablets, and if we could plug them in, then we used tablets, but if not, we had paper backup.
Was there a difference in how you responded based on?
So it was oral. So they were not doing it. We were asking them questions or recording answers. So it was always the same whether we were recording on a tablet or on paper. Yeah. These people are not often educated, as you saw, beyond a middle school age. So their capacity to read a computer, operate a computer, wouldn't work. So we like to just keep it the same for everybody. Yeah. Good question. All right. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate that.